The Honourable Steve Whan.
Aesthetics.
Madam Deputy President,
aesthetics.
This bill has a long history. This was first a discussion paper proposing the abolition of the Snowy Scientific Committee was first circulated in February 2013. This bill was introduced into the other place on the 15th of October 2013. Here we are nearly a year later, finally dealing with this bill in this place. And it reflects the lack of priority which this government has given to the Snowy River, and particularly to the scientific advice which should be going into the Snowy River. The opposition is strongly opposed to this bill for its effort to remove any source of independent scientific advice on the Snowy River. It's yet another sign of the Liberals and Nationals' hostility towards restoring the Snowy River. It's all about gutting the scientific committee and replacing it with a hand-picked group with no requirement for scientific expertise. And one of the key points about this is, which I'll come to in more detail later, that the scientific committee now has no requirement for there to be a scientist on the scientific committee. And it really is quite symbolic of where this government wants to go on it. The Nationals and Liberals demonstrate once again with this legislation that they simply don't understand or don't care that the task of restoring the Snowy is nowhere near complete. It has only just started, and for the Minister to stand up here and say that the government has delivered for the Snowy River simply demonstrates complete ignorance of the fact that it will take decades to restore the Snowy River, and that indeed the 21% flow going down the Snowy River is actually still 7% short of the 28% recommended by the various studies which were done into the river, and which, yes, wasn't committed by the governments in their agreement, but the commitment that was made at the time of the agreement was that we would achieve 21%, and then we would look again at whether it was possible to get the extra 7% flow for the Snowy River through other mechanisms or through continued mechanisms. And we've seen a really appalling history on the Scientific Committee from this government. The Scientific Committee last met in January 2011. The term of the Scientific Committee expired in, I think it was May 2011, and the then Minister and this government failed to appoint a new committee. After being pushed on this a number of times in the media by myself and by Dr Kay, they finally released this discussion paper in February 2013. Now, what we've seen over in the Snowy River is a long history of a community fight to restore the once mighty Snowy River. And when I go through that, it's not to say that we don't, particularly people in the Snowy Mountains region, appreciate the magnificent engineering expertise that brought us the Snowy scheme and the value that that's had. And it's a proud Labor achievement that the Snowy scheme exists at all, and a proud engineering achievement as well. And in fact, something which showed innovations in engineering which have been used ever since then across projects such as this around the world, from rock bolting techniques through the tunnelling and the various other engineering feats that were performed in this project. It is a magnificent wonder of Australia, the Snowy scheme. But there's no denying the fact that the Snowy scheme at the time didn't consider the future health of the Snowy River. It left 1% of the flow of the Snowy River running down that river, and for places like Dalgety that meant that they essentially lost the lifeblood of the area. Now, the fight to restore water to the Snowy River has been going for many decades. From the Snowy River Alliance's Snowy River story, way back in 1990, an interstate committee of scientists, water managers, public servants and community members from Victoria and New South Wales was established, called the Snowy River Interstate Catchment Coordinating Committee, to start to investigate the river's problems and to look at what could be done about it. The committee recommended that there did need to be more flows. In 1996, the Snowy River Alliance was formed, which was an amalgamation of a couple of groups which previously existed, including the Dalgety and District Community Association. And in 1996, a report commissioned and prepared by the New South Wales Department of Land and Water Conservation, Victorian Department of Natural Resources and Environment, and the Snowy Mountains Hydroelectric Authority recommended that a minimum of 28% of the original flow that passed Jindabyne before the dams were built be reinstated to the river. The Alliance pushed and lobbied for that, and when in 1997 corporatisation was proposed for the Snowy River, the argument gained a lot of traction, and the corporatisation work included provisions which we see today for things like the scientific committee and increased flows. Now, we saw a political history which assisted the Snowy River in this, and it came about because essentially of the Victorian election, where the Nationals put their colours, nailed their colours to the mast on this, and I quote from the Snowy River Alliance: "An election was looming in Victoria later that year. During the pre-election electioneering, the Deputy Premier and leader of the Victoria National Party, McNamara, visited Orbost. His schedule allowed no time for him to meet with the locals, but the Alliance, the Snowy River Alliance, discovered that the Deputy Premier would be travelling by light plane to Marlow Airport and then by car to the meeting venue. This provided the opportunity to talk with him, and members of the Alliance found themselves in the car with the Deputy Premier. He was asked, I'm sure he enjoyed that too, he was asked if he supported the Alliance's push for water for the Snowy. Being a politician from the Goulburn Irrigation District, he said no way would he help. The Alliance responded that it would stand a candidate in the upcoming election, to which he very indignantly replied, "Don't even think about it, we will crush you and walk all over you." Now, what happened in that election was that an independent member for East Gippsland, Craig Ingram, was elected overwhelmingly on a platform of restoring flows to the Snowy River.
Where is he now?
He achieved his aims.
Darwin.
He achieved his aims and had more terms than some National Party members get in Parliament. But Craig Ingram was then was able to negotiate with the incoming Labor government, who negotiated with the Labor government in New South Wales, and an agreement was reached to restore flows to the Snowy River. That was a historic occasion for the Snowy River, and I remember being there in 2002 when the first flows were released from the Whan aqueduct and released down the river into the Snowy River. It was something which was a long time coming, and for quite a while was only a small amount of the 21% flow which was to go down the river. That incredible day with Steve Bracks and Bob Carr and many others, including many people from the conservation movement and, most importantly, many people from the Dalgety and Jindabyne communities, was a day which was the first time a river like the Snowy River had governments commit to its restoration. And they were able to do it because of a very positive arrangement which was made, whereby Water for Rivers was created. And Water for Rivers worked to find the water savings. So it wasn't that the water for the Snowy River was going to be taken off the farmers or the irrigators on the western side of the scheme. It was actually to come from from water savings. And Water for Rivers invested a large amount of money, $150 million from the New South Wales Labor government, $150 million from the Victorian Labor government, and $75 million from the then coalition federal government, which was to fund those water savings. The larger percentage of those savings went down the Snowy, but some of those savings also went down the Murray River. So there was actually a benefit for both sides of the mountains, and there were some very important things undertaken there, like the Barron Box wetlands work, which was incredibly successful in saving water in the Murrumbidgee scheme, and was an example of the sort of things which could be done with work and capital infrastructure investment in irrigation areas to actually save the water to do this. And the point about this is that the Snowy River water savings were actually banked into an account, and the minister interjects before they were made, but he clearly, and this is the problem with the National Party and government, they don't actually understand the way this worked, because what happened was the Snowy River the Mwamba borrowing account was established. And so water was started to be released down the river, but it was borrowed against the savings which were going to be achieved later on. And during the long drought, a very small amount of extra water went down the river, and it wasn't until that borrowing account was actually paid back that we started to see the full flows start to be achieved down the river. And it's only in the last few years that we've seen the the 21% flow actually go down the river, and that's because of the way it was done. So the minister at the table actually is completely wrong in the way that he portrayed it, because the borrowing account was set up so that water which was utilised at the time down the Snowy would be paid back later on. Now, the importance of this for the local region, of course, is that a healthy Snowy River becomes a very important attraction for the area. Environmentally, it's very important because you see native fish able to come back in, and also trout. And the Snowy River is a river which was far from in its natural state. It had silted up, its channel had become less defined, it was choked with weeds and with willows and so on, and it simply wasn't the iconic Snowy River which people expect to see when they go to the region that I come from. And I released on the 5th of September 2003 a press release which talked about the extra work that needed to be undertaken. We had groups who were funded by the state government who went down and removed willows and other weeds from the rivers. They cleared the banks. They made sure that once the flooding flows started to come, blackberries were removed and so on, replanted native trees and shrubs in selected locations. And what that meant is that when the flooding flows and the regular flows started, that the river could actually start to re-establish a channel and start to look more like the Thredbo River above Jindabyne, Lake Jindabyne, which is a river that flows healthily. It has a rocky bottom, which is what native fish and many of the fish species need, rather than a silted up area of waterway. And that's a very important part of the restoration of the river, and the important thing for the government members to note, because they clearly, in all their speeches and from the previous minister through, don't understand this, is that job takes decades. It's not finished when 21% flow starts to flow down the river. It takes decades. And one of the first things that this government did when it came to office was, firstly, not reappoint the Snowy Scientific Committee, but then secondly, sack the scientists who were doing the river monitoring work. And those scientists who had undertaken the baseline work on the river were very important, because it was going to be, had it continued, the first time anywhere in the world that you would have had scientific studies which would have showed baseline right through restoration of a river. And in sacking those staff, the government sacrificed a lot of that work which was being undertaken. And it goes to the very clear attitude that you see from government, from this government, that they think that the job is done because 212 gigalitres of water is going down the Snowy River, and that's around about the 21%. Of flow. Now, there's a couple of key flaws in what this government is proposing with this scientific committee, and at the start I mentioned the first of those, which is that there's no requirement for actually to be scientific representation on the committee. The previous committee had principal functions to advise the Water Administration Ministerial Corporation each year on the regime for the release of water for environmental reasons under the Snowy Water Licence, to advise the corporation from time to time on the adequacy of those releases. And that's a very important point, because that doesn't exist in the new task, to advise on the adequacy of those releases. So in other words, should we be moving from 21% to 28%? Is that necessary for the health of the river? We probably won't really know the answer for that for another few years till we see whether or not the current flows are successful. Of course, there'll be some people who say immediately that it should, and I do suspect that in the long term we should be moving to that. The committee was to produce every year a public State of the Environment report on the catchments and the Snowy and other rivers and streams. Because part of the job that was given to this group was actually the upper montane rivers, the rivers above Lake Jindabyne, which have also been affected by the scheme, and the health of those rivers. And that's again something that's been ignored by this government. That's another task which isn't being given to this. The old committee consisted of 6 members, one nominated by the Environment Protection Authority, one nominated by the Director-General of National Parks and Wildlife, one nominated by the Catchment Management Authority for the local area, which of course has now been abolished by this government, 2 nominated by the State of Victoria, and an independent scientist with expertise in aquatic environments who was the chairperson of the committee. The committee was specifically not subject to the control or direction of the minister, and the period of office was 3 years. It was eventually appointed in 2008. It did take a while for the committee to be appointed because the government of the day waited until the actual borrowings account had been paid back and we were getting flows to actually deal with properly on the river before it appointed it. And I do know that created some angst for those supporters of the Snowy River. Now, the government in this proposal that it's putting forward here today has decided that not only will this committee be appointed by the minister of the day, it will lose its independence. It won't need to have a scientist on the committee. They're broadening it out to take in other community representations, which, you know, that's fine, but maybe you do that on another committee, because this was meant to be a scientific committee which advised on water releases, flow patterns and adequacy of those releases. The government in their speeches, including the member for Monero, have stood up in the other place and they've said that, that the community wanted to see a broader committee with community representation. Well, I've got to tell you, there is not a single community representative who has said to me that they wanted this committee to be changed, or has said to me that it needed broader representation. And indeed, one of the loudest advocates, the government says, well, we're going to put an Indigenous representative on this committee. Well, one of the loudest critics of this proposal is an Indigenous representative in the local community. And you know, the government's assertions in this are nothing more than spin to try and justify the fact that they don't support the objectives of the scientific committee. They don't support the Snowy River having independent scientific scrutiny of the way that the water flows are being managed, and they simply don't support the objectives which saw us trying to restore the Snowy River in the first place. Now, the scientific committee, in its short period of existence, did release at least one report. Its last report that I could find is February 2009, response to the Snowy Scientific... Oh, actually, they did produce a report, and this is the response to the Snowy Scientific Committee report on adequacy and environmental releases to the Snowy River. That was actually the New South Wales government's response. And that's what we're going to be losing. We won't have an independent committee which can challenge the department and the government in the terms of its advice that it's providing on the flows. This year, the government did change the flow regime, and it did so on the expert advice of the department. And I acknowledge that there is people in the department who have a lot of expertise in this area, but there is no one independent to actually say whether they feel that is right. No.
Come on, hear him in silence.
The minister at the table again revealing his complete ignorance about this issue, because what I've said is that 21% flow has been achieved, and what's happened is it's actually not the environmental flows. You can have several different models for them. There is a number of models which suggest that flooding flows are something which is necessary. The government has moved to a variable flow regime this year. But my point about this is there is no independent scientific analysis of this. The government has cut the people who are doing the river monitoring, who are actually doing the studies to see whether or not the flow regime was having an effect and what effect it was having on the river. There is no doubt that the health of the river is improving, but it's improving slowly. We are seeing more water going past places like Dalgety. We're seeing some shifting of sediment going on, but that takes some years to do that. And we're seeing the river shape change. But we've also seen, obviously, major improvements on the riverbanks from the several $1 million of investment that the previous Labor government made to actually removing the weeds and things along the banks. And that is something which is... the minister at the table says you didn't fund anything to 2008. In fact, we were funding the improvements on the riverbank. We're actually funding the improvements to the riverbank in 2003, Minister. Oh, we've got to change his tune now for his interjections. Row Resources Committee. The committee wasn't appointed till 2008, Minister. And in fact, again, he doesn't understand the fact that before the committee was appointed in 2008, the scientific staff were on the ground doing the river monitoring and getting the baseline work. And those are the people that your government sacked when it came to office in 2011. And I remember very well the Snowy River Day of 2011, where The community for some years had been gathering to mark the day the waters were first released, and in 2007 they gathered with a great deal of sadness because they were actually farewelling the staff who had been sacked by your government, who'd been undertaking the work on the river. And we've seen that expertise now disappear to the community, expertise which turned out every year at that, went to the local shows, explained what was happening with the recovery of the river. And when I went to the Dalgety show this year, there was no Snowy stall there. What a shame, because his government had cut the resources. On the banks of the Snowy, no one there to say what was going on. Now, this is a change which has concerned the people who've put their hearts and souls into the restoration of the Snowy River over many years. And we've seen that with a number of comments in the media. John Gallard, Angel John Gallard, as he's known, who has been unwell lately but has been one of the people who has been a long-term campaigner for the Snowy River, who spoke on ABC PM, giving outrage about the government's suggested changes. He certainly wasn't consulted about it. He wasn't one of the people who, as an Indigenous representative, was one of the people that the member for Monero claims had been telling him that there needed to be a broader representation on the committee. And he was very concerned about the independence of the committee going. I, along with many other people, have had outraged calls from the Dalgety community about this. People who were involved in the fight. And I want to acknowledge some of the people who are involved that I know in this fight to get the Snowy River running again over many years, because for all this government's attempts to destroy and stop the progress that's being made, we do have 21% flow as a result of Labor governments and their actions, and that is something that even this government won't be able to reverse. But we saw the Snowy River Alliance, including the Dalgety community, which worked for many years to achieve that. And the current chair of that, Vicky Wallace, is a person who's been on the phone to many people in this place, I'm sure, expressing her total displeasure about what the government's done in this. People like Acacia Rose and Angel John Gallard, who I mentioned before. Previous people involved in the alliance, Joe Garland, who was there on the day in 2003, Paul Leet, who was involved. Craig Ingram, of course, I mentioned before, the former member for East Gippsland, and an absolutely critical person in this process, who was elected as an independent member in Victorian Parliament on the basis of the Nationals rejecting doing any work on this. And of course, in the New South Wales government, Bob Carr was the leader at the time, but John Delabosca was a critical person who put a lot of this together. And of course, Steve Bracks, the former Victorian Premier. So there is a lot of people in the community of Jindabyne and Dalgety and the region who've put their heart and souls into this, and I know that they are bitterly disappointed with the way this government has acted. It's an interesting thing when you notice the history of the National Party in this. The National Party that actually opposed the Snowy scheme, opposed it vehemently when Labor tried to put it in. When Labor put it in place. The minister says that's a fib. It is not. Go on the record and have a look. Go and have a look at the historic record of this. Oh, okay, the Country Party. You're right. We want to be semantic about it. Yes, once upon a time, the National Party used to represent the country, supposedly. But anyway, the Country Party of the time, and so the Country Party, now National Party, vehemently opposed it. They then opposed, of course, restoring water to the Snowy River and opposed the efforts to save water to actually do that. They were consistently cynical about the work of water for rivers, and now, in fact, have changed. Now, I'll acknowledge the minister's injector, and I'm sure he now acknowledged how successful they were as well with the work they did with Lake McCowan and the Barron Box wetland, the Calm project, which was something which is still producing incredible dividends in the Murrumbidgee system. And in fact, I was listening to the Lower House today with the government bragging about water savings initiatives, most of which actually came out of the models put in place by Labor governments to save water. And the fact is that that is the real history of water savings in New South Wales is it's been driven by Labor governments. And the farmers benefit from those because it wasn't taken off them. The water for the Snowy River wasn't purchased from them on the market. It was saved and then returned to both sides of the mountain, and that is the positive way to go about it, and that's the way that New South Wales State Labor has advocated water savings being made for the whole time. That position that New South Wales Labor has taken is something which was consistent before the election when we were discussing with the federal government the Murray-Darling Basin proposals as well. So what we have here tonight is an appalling bit of legislation which seeks to take away the independence of the Snowy Scientific Committee, which reinforces for us once again this government's complete hostility towards restoring the mighty Snowy River, a hostility which has gone from day one of this fight to actually get the Snowy River restored and which continues today. We have a government which seeks to remove the scientific representation on the committee. You know, they say, of course, oh, don't you worry, we'll appoint a scientist. Well, we do worry about that because we've seen the commitment, because it's demonstrated most vividly by the fact that this committee was supposed to have been reappointed in May 2011, and it's now August 2014. We've had this legislation sitting on the table for nearly a year. We've had local members who've been out there in the media saying that it was being blocked by the upper house when they hadn't even brought it to the upper house to test what was going on with it. We've had, in fact, even efforts at embarrassing apologies about this, where the member for Monero in May the 29th, 2012, May 29th, 2012, said we've worked through a number of administrative processes, having a look at the functions of the committee, the compositions and so on. So look, no excuses, it's probably taken a lot longer than it should have, but we're close to making that announcement and the Minister will do so in due course. Well, due course took a hell of a long time because it's now August 2014. We've had this government breaching the legislation by not having the committee in place, and having this legislation just sitting around on the table for nearly a year, well over a year since the discussion paper was first released. It's an appalling example of this government's attitude to the Snowy River, their attitude to the people of Dalgety in the region who want to see the Snowy River restored, not only for the environmental health of that area, but for the tourism benefit that can bring to the river. And one thing I can tell you is that when there is significant flows going down the river released from Jindabyne Dam, and of course part of the long wait for the water to actually go down the river was because the construction work on Jindabyne Dam took many years to do, and not surprisingly, incredibly significant amount of work that happened there. But one of the things that you see when the releases are made is a number of people who go to Dalgety to stand on the riverbank and watch the water coming by, watch the Snowy River actually going up. And a lot of them are older people who remember the Snowy before it flowed, but there's also a lot of young people who turn up just to see something that they think is an important event. Many people go to the Jindabyne Dam to watch the water being released. It's an attraction in itself for the local region, and it's been done in a way which ensures that it's through efficiencies which have not harmed any other water user as it's gone through. Yes, there's of course been a cost for Snowy Hydro in the amount of water which is stored in the dams at times, but again they've been considered as part of the licence agreement that they had, and it was all planned in as part of that licence agreement. So that doesn't seem to have negatively affected there. But once again, I reiterate Labor's opposition to this bill. This bill is a sellout of the people who worked so hard in the community to restore the Snowy River. It's a sellout by the member for Monero of the people that he claims to represent, and has demonstrated in his speech in the other place such an appalling affinity with. Willing to make excuses for this government's lack of action on the Snowy, and this government's stalling and procrastinating over appointing a committee and then finally deciding that it wants to gut the committee and replace it with something it can control. This river is far too important to have been caught up in this. The Snowy River, 21% flow. We need to be looking at whether or not it should go to 28% in the long term. That won't happen under this government, as we heard in estimates a couple of years ago. And I have very little confidence in this government's capacity to manage the flows in the long term. Labor opposes this bill strenuously.